For problem number 17 of the MSP practice test, this is the final question in the practice test. And in this test, you're given a set of data in table form for different buildings in different cities and how tall they are in stories or in height. So 110 stories, 442 meters tall, 102 stories, 381 meters tall. And part of this is we're looking at the question of, is there a trend in the data? Whenever we're seeing data like this, we're always asking about trends in the data, and can we make predictions based on those trends? So it says the height of skyscrapers are often given in numbers of stories in a building rather than in standard measures like meters or feet. And then it says the following table gives the height of the 10 tallest buildings in the United States as of 2006 in stories and meters. And then you can see that that data has been taken and put into what we call a scattered data plot. And in a scattered data plot, they're just simply plotted wherever they fall on the chart. And whenever we see data like this, we always want to ask, is there a trend? As we increase the number of stories, is there an increase in the number of height? And it would seem to make sense that there should be somewhat of an increase in height. Is that trend linear or straight line? In other words, could I or would I think that it makes sense to draw a straight line through that data? And I could, again, do that kind of a thing if I wanted to. So, or I could say, well, it really kind of curves upward a little bit. We're going to go ahead and draw a line through this, though, because it's close enough. It will give us some sort of a idea. So I want to try to get a line that kind of goes through the middle of those dots as much as possible. And it's not going to be perfect. It's a guess to some extent. And so that just helps me to see the trend. The upward trend is the number of stories increase, the height of the buildings increase, which makes sense. And then the question for this problem is to make a prediction in meters. So we're going to make a prediction in meters for the height of a new skyscraper 95 stories. So if we're going to build something that was 95 stories and we want to predict its height based on this data, there's a couple of ways we can do that. One is we can go back to the table and say, well, if the building is 95 stories, let's look for something close to that, like 100 stories. So here's a 100-story building, and it's 343 meters tall. And then the next closest to it would be 83 stories, and it's actually taller than the 100-story building. So maybe it has an extension on the top of it that extends it. So it looks like we're having a 95-story building. It's going to be somewhere in this 340 meters tall range. And so we could predict that. Or you look at this one that's 102, it's 381 meters. So you have some kind of movement around there. 77 stories, 319, so much smaller. So one way would be to just compare it to other ones that are about that size. And so I could say a reasonable guess would be around 340 meters based on these two buildings here. Or I could actually go to my trend line in the data and try to locate on here approximately where 95 would be. So if that's 80 and that's 100, 90 is halfway, and then 95 would be about here. I'm going to take my ruler. I'm actually going to make a line going upward from where I think 95 is. And go up to that point right there. And then over from that point, looks like just under 400. So right here, so if that's 300, it's 350, it looks like around 375 or 380. 380 meters tall. Now that might be a little bit taller than I would expect, but again, that's all this is based on estimates of where I drew that line. If I draw that line a little bit flatter, maybe I brought that line up too high because of that one there, that building that seems to be sort of much taller than any other building. And that would be the Sears Tower. It is quite a bit taller than the others, so it tended to pull my line up a bit. Maybe that's too much. Maybe these are a better estimate in here. And you can see how on a problem like this, the answers there's a whole variety of answers that could be right, because again, we're estimating, we're using this data to try to describe where it would be. So if I were to predict, since I looked at it a couple different ways, we're around maybe 380 in one case, or 340 to 343, 346. I think a reasonable estimate, I'm going to go somewhere in between, and I'm just going to say that I think that this skyscraper would probably be around 380 meters tall, based on my trend line in the graph. I could do it that way, or I might be able to support it by saying it's going to be around 340 meters tall, based on the table and these two buildings here that I looked at, the Aeon Center. So 340 meters tall based on the table and two buildings that are around the same number of stories. Okay. So now what I might do is say, well, okay, these are kind of not exactly the same, so how about if I compromise and go in between? We just say 360 meters tall based on the two estimates combined. This so you can see what I'm writing. And so again, you can see there's no right answer for this one, but there are reasonable answers. It wouldn't be reasonable for me to predict that at 95 stories it would be 500 meters tall. It wouldn't be reasonable for me to predict that at 95 stories it would be under 300 meters tall. And so my estimates are based on reasonable numbers from the data, reasonable numbers from the graph, and so that there's a set of answers that are within reason, even though there's not an exact right answer, because again, we're making predictions based on data, and again, based on scattered data that's not exactly in a straight line. So we're really trying to get close, or something that's reasonable, using a trend line, using scattered data, using a table, and comparing data within a table. And so that's how you would use this information, again, to make predictions. My predictions based on the trend line in the graph, or based on the two buildings that are around the same number of stories, or even just taking both sets of estimates and putting them together and maybe finding an average between the two. And that's one way to find the height of a skyscraper 95 stories tall in this problem.